Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Diane Winston, professor of journalism and communication at the University of Southern California, author of her latest, Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstream Reagan's Evangelical Vision. Diane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here today.
So let's start with something that was a big surprise to me, because I turned 18 just on Reagan's second election and missed by voting against him by 3 weeks. And what really surprised me about your book was learning that he was as religious as he was. I had no idea, and that was certainly not the way that he was portrayed at the time, as far as I can remember, at least in the communication that I received. I feel like other people were receiving different communication about him, but he wasn't. We talk about that for a moment.
Well, Sam, I think you were receiving the communication most people were, because the media saw Reagan's religiosity as basically a ploy to win voters. They said he never went to church, he didn't show any signs of religiosity. So reporters tended to think of him as opportunistically religious. However, if you go into the records and the history, you will see that he had a very long-standing connection to Christianity. When he was growing up, many of his friends thought he would become a minister because he was so engaged in his church. And after he left the presidency, there was a letter that reporter Karen Tumulty found in Nancy Reagan's possession that Reagan had written to her father when he was on his deathbed, when her father was on his deathbed. And basically Reagan said, I know you've been an atheist all your life, but if you don't embrace Jesus, you will be in hell forever. I will not see you again. Please, please reconsider. Please become a follower of Jesus. That's not verbatim, but that's what the letter said.
And we should just be clear. The letter wasn't written after his presidency. The letter was found after his presidency.
I think the letter was written after his presidency, but it was found after his presidency.
Okay.
And that's a pretty clear indication of someone's religiosity.
Yes, I would imagine. And I understand the sort of like, I mean, he was at least twice divorced, I think it was, and he was from Hollywood at least at one point. And so there's this sort of perception that he wouldn't be religious. But how did his message of religiosity get to the right ears, I guess is the question.
Well, he was a hard sell to some conservative evangelicals because, as you say, he was divorced. He was from Hollywood. And most of all, he had been president of a union. He'd been president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was a pretty good Democrat until that time. So he had a lot of convincing to do. He began that when he ran for governor of California, and he began to talk about his evangelical bona fides. He went to a very conservative church in LA, and a lot of those folks began letting it be known that he was born again, he was saved, and that he would be a good Christian politician.
What was the? Talk about Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, which had really started to gain steam, I guess, in the years in which he was in California as governor, and even in his first run for the presidency. They were like, how did that relationship develop there? Like, I mean, if the media was out there with this notion of Reagan as not a religious person, that he was, more sort of like coastal in his sensibility, how did the message get communicated? Because I'm comparing it to like Donald Trump, who's also a coastal figure, who also multiple divorced, also does not appear to be religious. I also happen to think he's not. Yeah. But Mike Pence ended up being the vehicle for bringing
Yeah.
along those people, when needed. For George W. Bush, he was a self-proclaimed reborn, and they used marriage equality to establish his bona fides. How did Reagan do this in a way that reached the evangelicals, who were only then around that era, at least in the late 70s, starting to enter into the sort of like what had been prior left to Caesar was no longer only Caesar's purview?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Sam. Most people don't know it, but Jerry Falwell also had a church in Orange County, California, and he had known Reagan for a while. Falwell initially was not supportive of Reagan when Reagan was governor because Reagan did not clamp down on abortion like Falwell had hoped. But subsequently, Reagan began becoming more outspoken about his conservative evangelical policies. He was a strong law and order governor. He cut back welfare here in California. And I think that after the debacle of Barry Goldwater in '64, Republicans knew they needed to put a friendly face on their conservative policies. And Reagan began barnstorming the country, talking to a lot of groups through his General Electric connections, going to churches, and he managed to convince evangelicals. One of the big turning points was when he spoke in Dallas to a large crowd of Southern Baptists and other evangelicals and said, I support you. I'm your guy. And his sincerity got through to them. And at that point, they were so desperate to get someone in there to repeal Roe versus Wade and to return prayer in school that they were willing to go with what might have been an unusual candidate at a prior time.
You write about how the media sort of both ignored or put a more benign face, to the extent that or maybe even ignored Reagan's personal religiosity, but ended up like creating a narrative that was imbued with this religiosity. Can you talk about that and tell us what religious imaginary means?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but the media is an important part of the story. And I sometimes think I have trouble getting that across because the media is still the vehicle to tell the story. A friend who was a reporter at Time magazine when Reagan was running the first time said that Henry Grunwald, who was ahead of Time then, told the staff, we've already killed 3 presidents. I don't want to do a 4th. In other words, he was very well aware of the fact that Carter, Ford, and Nixon had all been slammed in the media, and the media bore responsibility for all their falls. And he didn't think doing that to Reagan was a smart idea. So that, to me, is key in terms of how the media covered him, because at that point in time, we did not have the many outlets we have today, and media followed each other. So if Time was doing something, you could pretty well be sure that Newsweek and New York Times and Washington Post were doing it all. Reagan seemed to many of them like a sweet older man, genial, cowboy type. They weren't going to go after him in the same way that they had gone after his predecessors. That's number one. Now,
and can I just add, just so for the context for people who are watching the program who are all younger than me, Time magazine was the pinnacle. I mean, the New York Times were certainly up there too, but Time magazine, we have no analog in today's media landscape to what Time magazine and Newsweek was. Newsweek was sort of like like following, almost like comedically following Time, but it was also quite big. I mean, Newsweek was big, but Time was it. It was the center of the news media. And this is in an era when we had 3 news stations that were at 6 p.m. every night, and that was it for an hour, half hour, depending on what it was. and then the New York Times, and that was basically it. That's where 95% of the population got its news.
Exactly so. And if the head of that organization was basically telling his reporters, go soft on Reagan because we don't want to be responsible for the fourth president's decline, that is a major deal. That you're exactly right, Sam. It's hard to understand today because there's not the same kind of media monopoly and media gateposts. And as I said, Reagan was depicted by the media as this genial older man who smiled a lot and made gaffes. And, they had stories about him that, they would tell, but they really didn't understand what was going on underneath, which was this, as you say, conservative turn that he was perpetuating in his rhetoric, which the media itself picked up. So if he said something like the Soviet Union is an evil empire, which was something he said in a speech in March 1983 to the National Association of Evangelicals, most reporters didn't really talk about that because they thought it was like really weird and stupid, and they didn't know how to put it into a news article, like who calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. But his evangelical conservative followers totally got what he was saying. He was saying that we are in a cosmic struggle with communism. Communism is our ultimate enemy. And we as Christians need to fight a system that's anti-God, anti-capitalism, and anti-democracy. And to some extent, that is how the message got to evangelicals, because they had ears to hear what secular people might not have.
I want to just add too, about the first point about Reagan getting treated with kid gloves. They called him Teflon Ron at that time, exactly. Where nothing would stick to Ronald Reagan, but nothing would stick to Ronald Reagan. What became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and there was no attempts to make anything stick to Reagan. And also, it's also amazing to hear the idea that calling the Soviet Union an evil empire was so anachronistic then, because the idea of calling our enemies evil now is almost like no one doesn't do that. Right. Like at the time, people have to understand that things had secularized in civil society in such a way that good, evil, no, there may be our enemy, they may be, but you don't use that religious language to describe these things any more than you would, I don't know, some weird sports metaphor or something.
Exactly. And that's why the phrase was not quoted in most articles, in most television broadcasts, until, if at all, the very end of the piece, where, they kind of threw it in.
Talk more about he began to appeal, because this is in 1983. The 1984 election happens, and by all accounts, at least the political, the professors I had in college, on day one we started, and they talked to us and they said, you've just witnessed a realignment of the voting electorate in 1984, and that was his reelection. And talk about what was involved in that turn, and then we can get to sort of how his notion of these three, or his version of the three freedoms, which is more of like a trinity of freedoms.
Exactly. Basically, after World War II, we had a political consensus around a welfare state. And FDR had put the New Deal into play. We basically were a country that was getting more and more prosperous. We believed that the economy could help everyone thrive and become more comfortable and lead a better life. That ended in the 60s and 70s for a variety of reasons, including the war in Vietnam, the counterculture, the creation of the birth control pill, women's liberation, the growth of Black power, the beginnings of the economy going offshore, and finally the oil shortage that was precipitated when we aided Israel in the 1973 war. And as a result, the oil countries cut off our supply of oil, which caused a lot of financial distress and a lot of long gas lines. So by the mid-70s, people were pretty fed up with everything. And one of the reasons they looked to Carter for change was because he promoted himself as a practical businessman. Things only got worse under Carter, and they culminated with the Iranian hostage crisis when the Shah was dethroned and Iranian militants took Americans hostage. I realize now that I have given enough history to make viewers want to either run to their history books or to YouTube to catch up on everything that went on during that period. A lot went on, suffice to say. And by 1980, voters were ready for someone to say, all this shit is past. We have to put the country back together. We are going to make America great again. That was Reagan's slogan, which Trump took. Make America great again. Reagan promised to turn the country back to something wonderful. And people wanted to hear that message. And I believe that was partly why the media was so gentle with him, because they saw this was a message that America needed. Now, for Reagan, that message was predicated on fulfilling God's role for Americans. Reagan truly believed that God blessed America with freedom. He truly believed that God wanted Americans to be free. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, and I point to 1983 as an example, he put these messages into his policy statements. And one good example is his desire to cut back welfare. He said he wanted to cut back welfare because he wanted to cut back taxes. He linked the two. But he had another reason for cutting back welfare, which was he believed people should take responsibility for themselves. Part of being free was taking responsibility for yourself. And so the two, cutting taxes, taking responsibility, were linked for him. Now, for people who were religious, they could hear the religious idea of taking care of yourself. For people who weren't religious, they could hear cutting taxes, saving money. And that way, a religious message could intertwine with a pragmatic message and thus gain favor with the population. Does that make sense?
It does. And we should just also say, though, this also coincides with the sort of continuing backlash from the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the idea that welfare was, and he did a lot to do this, was turned into something that was largely appreciated by Americans to something that was only for Black people. And he gave us the welfare mom and the pink Cadillac or something. I can't remember exactly what he had said. And then, of course, we also know that he opened up his 1980 national campaign near the Neshoba County Fair, which was the site of, or right around the corner from the site of where 3 civil rights workers were famously killed in Mississippi. So all of this stuff, he's sort of managed to reach all of these constituencies with religious language that we, just as the non-religious, speaking for myself, we're not coded to understand that.
Exactly so. Yeah.
And how did that fit into his rhetoric on the Soviet Union as well? The doublespeak for religious people. You touched on it earlier, but just the these notions of evil connected with communism and the lack of religiosity versus the religious evangelical vision of capitalism in the United States.
Yes, yeah, that's right, Emma. He very much believed, as I said, that God blessed America with religious, economic, and political freedom. And he saw the Soviet Union basically as an evil empire because it denied people the ability to worship or to be religious. Communism was a contradiction of capitalism. There was no free market. There was no individual property. And it was a totalitarian state. People had no ability to vote for their leaders. So for those very reasons, he believed communism had to be destroyed, which is kind of amazing if you think about it, because, by the end of his term, the Soviet Union was over.
Yes. We should also say, and you mentioned him, General Electric, in between his role as a SAG president, General Electric hired him to go around and basically campaign against universal health care, and intertwine that this message of anti-communism with the idea that, like, if people get health care, we're going to get that. But talk about those Trinity of Freedoms, as you call them.
Well, political freedom is pretty clear. It's the ability to vote for candidates, to express your political ideas, to have a voice. It's democracy. Economic freedom for him.
Did it also, though? I mean, you're right that also involved limited government. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say economic freedom meant freedom from government regulations.
Okay.
Which the limited government, yes, that's part of the political freedom, but it's also a very big part of economic freedom. That a free market was not only what we think of as a free market, but it also meant you and I are free to have the government off of our backs when we want to create our own businesses. So economic freedom meant limited government. Reagan believed the less government, the better. In fact, one of his best known quotes is, "The 9 words most Americans fear is, I am from the government and I am here to help you." He believed that the less government, the better. Now, his idea of religious freedom was not what you or I might think it is. It's more the idea of religious liberty that conservatives are pressing now. And that is to say, if you are a religious person and you do not want to serve gay people or make them a cake for their wedding, you do not have to do that. So religious freedom to Reagan meant you were free to have your religious ideas and act on them, despite the outcome to others.
Religious law trumps civil law in this instance. I mean, for all intents and purposes.
Yes. I mean, in this realm, right. I mean, Reagan wasn't talking about a kind of Sharia, but he was talking about
he was talking about Christian law. I mean, he was specifically talking. I mean, like, what, it is. I mean, if they had the opportunity to impose covenant marriages on all of us, I have little doubt that they would. I would little doubt that Speaker Johnson wouldn't impose covenant marriages on everyone. If they had the ability to, have the government in many respects penalize people for divorce, they certainly would penalize people for having sex out of marriage. I mean, 6 years after Reagan leaves office, no less, 4 years, Patrick Buchanan is out there chastising, Murphy Brown, a fictional character, for having a child out of wedlock. Or was that Dan Quayle? I think it was Dan Quayle, actually, who was George Herbert Walker. I mean, this was their mentality. And in many respects, for the individual practitioners, their Christian law trumped civil law in this instance.
Yes, but I would I find it deeply ironic that I am sitting here defending Ronald Reagan, because I did vote in those elections, and I was deeply depressed when he was elected, and even more depressed when he was reelected. So I have to say, I don't think that Reagan would have been on board with Mike Johnson. I don't think Reagan believed in, Mike Johnson talks about a biblical republic. I don't think that's what Reagan ever had in mind. In fact, if you look at what he did, he was much more concerned with the political and economic sides of the religious argument than the social ones. He was more interested in getting rid of the Soviet Union and getting rid of government regulations than he was in repealing Roe versus Wade and getting prayer back in school. So Reagan did begin the shift that has given us Mike Johnson and Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And for that, I will forever hate him or dislike him. But I don't believe that their politics would have jibed with his. And I pray that he would have been calling them out, as Liz Cheney.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I mean, I can accept that his personal politics may not have been where Mike Johnson's were, but when we elect a president, we're not just electing the president, right? And he is building this coalition, and he doesn't just have to say to these people coded things that they will acknowledge. When it comes to staffing and when it comes to putting people into position, and I'm thinking like Ed Meese who was the attorney general, who started going after pornography. Now, I don't know that Ronald Reagan himself personally cared about pornography. When you have a surgeon general who's basically waving off the burgeoning AIDS epidemic, and the Reagans themselves sort of like being seen as like whatever, but a whole apparatus that is refusing to respond to an epidemic. This is a function of, regardless of what he believed personally, it wasn't enough for him to say, we're going to staff this administration with people who are not going to go after pornography. We're going to staff this administration with lawyers at the DOJ who are not going to go after voting rights. We're going to staff, our healthcare system with people who are going to actually take this seriously. He did the opposite.
Sam, you're totally correct. He was a conservative. That's why I didn't vote for him. That's why most people I know didn't vote for him. That's why I didn't like his presidency. And that's why I had a lot of problems with those 8 years. The fact of the matter is that I've come to realize there are bad conservatives, and there are even worse conservatives, and there are really terrible, scary conservatives. And, that is a sad commentary to make on our politics, because in retrospect, as many horrible things that Reagan administration did, it pales in comparison, I think, to what we're looking at today, which is a true repeal of our sexual freedoms, of our personal freedoms, of our democracy. So, I'm not extolling Reagan. I'm just saying that it got a lot worse.
How did we get from there to here?
Reagan legitimized I was talking earlier about that welfare state consensus. Reagan legitimized a move away from that to a more market-oriented philosophy. And basically, the market is not ethical. The market is not humanitarian. The market doesn't care about people. The market cares about money. And that sort of mentality is what drives our country today. And that, I think, because Reagan kind of swathed it, he wrapped it in religion and spirituality, and he said cutting taxes is doing good for the poor because you're making them personally responsible. because he said that, we should fight enemies who don't believe in our views. He legitimated a way of thinking that instead of bringing people together, I think begin to polarize them and pull them apart.
It's interesting because I think, you can look back at the Carter administration and certainly see deregulation, and, bringing in, I think it was Volcker, and anti-unionism, a burgeoning anti-unionism that was happening there. But my sense is it wasn't trumpeted as a value in the same way that it was with Reagan, and that Reagan made it sort of almost like a full-on aspirational value.
Right, and that's because Carter's Christianity was a more communal humanitarian type of belief than Reagan's. Conservative and evangelicals are very much about individualism. You are saved because of your relationship with Jesus. I'd like to save you, but it's your responsibility to get saved. And that sort of emphasis on individualism is part of the vision that Reagan instituted. It's okay to be about yourself. It's okay because you're taking responsibility. It's okay because, it's your life and your freedom. And it's important to remember that many of us in this country who are not tremendously religious don't take religion seriously. But I believe that people need a vision for their politics, because if we're all going to be members of the state, pay our taxes, stand in line, we have to believe that there's some greater good to what we're doing. And part of the reason for Trump's success is because the Reagan vision is no longer holding, and people are angry and frustrated, and they want something to believe in. Now, unfortunately, what I think a lot of the conservatives today believe in is just tear it all down. Let's get rid of everything. That's their vision. That's a scary vision. I mean, Reagan's individualism and market philosophy was detrimental enough. Tearing the whole place up is really scary.
But that's like, it seems to me just a matter of degree, right? I mean, the Reagan guy, once you say the 5 scariest words in the language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Traveling from there to, we should get rid of government and tear it all down doesn't seem to be a huge sort of, I mean, those two sentiments seem consistent. One may be more dramatic than the other, but once you get to one place and you realize that government is not here, it's not helpful, it's an obstacle. The idea of getting rid of it, deconstructing the administrative state, as Steve Bannon said that they were doing in the first Trump administration, seems to be the logical conclusion.
You know what? That is really smart, and I'm going to use it because that shows the line between Reagan and Trump even more clearly than I had stated it. But yes, that's exactly true. Unfortunately, it's not a good idea, right?
Oh no, yes, I agree. I agree. It's a bad idea. But I just want to also just like, where is the media now in your perspective? If the media at that time was hands off of Reagan because essentially there was a sense by the elite, we need to settle things down. We've had a decade essentially, and maybe a decade and a half. I mean, coming into 1980, assassination, resignation, the guy who pardoned the resigner, he's out. And Jimmy Carter, the malaise it was called, and sort of like the vulnerability of America with 450 days of hostage taking, held by Iran. Every night Ted Koppel's going on television, counting it down or clocking it. And the elite who control the elite media in this country, and there was almost no other media when you're talking about national politics, them, the elite media at that time, decide we need to have stability. So we are going to largely support this president through everything he was saying in terms of his campaign, and then ultimately into Iran-Contra, if you ask me. Then like what did the media continue to do when they adopted this rhetoric or they adopted this framing or didn't call it out? Like, how did it continue?
At the same time that all this was happening, much of the media, which had been in family hands, began to pass into corporate chains. And families tended to be rooted in the community and know their community, whereas corporations began to look more at the bottom line. Part of what was happening, therefore, which also helped Reagan, was that USA Today, the USA Today response. USA Today, which came out during that first term of Reagan's, totally changed the way people looked at the news. USA Today was news for television. It was bright, light, colorful, graphic, short, peppy, happy. And its success kind of took newspapers away from the hard-charging, investigative journalism into being more happy, friendly. Now, the change of the newspapers to become more happy, friendly, and the consolidation of newspaper chains basically stopped a lot of breaking stories and a lot of criticism of Reagan and the government. And as you said, when people did criticize Reagan, oftentimes it didn't stick. In fact, after the Grenada War, when reporters began saying none of this stuff really was as the government told us, no one even believed it. No one even cared. They bought the narrative that the government told them that we had won that war. Now, flash forward to today. We have so many more options. We have so many more newspapers, but it's increasingly driven by this market sensibility of how many eyeballs do you have? How many ears do you have? What do people want to hear about? And what we've seen over the last couple of years is people love to hear about pussycats and car crashes. And Trump has really benefited from this by making himself a sensation that media want to report on. The big question to me is, do we want to continue with media hyping Trump the way they have been, or would it be better to pull back on that?
I mean, that to me seems like a separate question. I mean, and I get the what happened with the media, and people I don't know will remember. I remember when USA Today first came out, people were very worried that we were trivializing news. In fact, USA Today now is actually not is a much stronger publication in my mind. But at that time, it was specifically for prior to things like Instagram and TikTok and social media. It was set out to appeal to a smaller attention span. But also subsequent during that time, Reagan changed the telecommunication, or I should say, Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine. And there was a loosening. Clinton really did it more so, but there was a loosening of ownership requirements and really a change in the media. And that also, over the course of that next 10 years, news, which used to be a loss leader, became a profit center for the television and whatnot. But I guess I'm most interested in the adoption of a religious framework in the way that we communicate and how this language entered into our lexicon without any alarm bells going off, it seemed like.
What do you mean by religious lexicon?
Like the idea of talking about, to throw off and say blank is evil, evil of Axis, to go from when Reagan says it's an evil empire in the 80s to 20 years later when Bush can say evil of Axis, and that becomes acts of evil, rather. The idea of using religious coded terminology in our politics without sort of anyone saying, hey, wait a second, in any type of without the mainstream media having any sort of awareness that was happening, seems pretty astonishing to me.
But I think that you just hit on it. The mainstream media is populated by a lot of people who aren't tremendously religious and who don't understand religion. And they don't care about it. They think it's superstitious. They think it's stupid. And so to them, when they see language like that, they use it only because they think it's so dopey. And they are kind of showing oh, Jerry Falwell, he says, God is punishing homosexuals. Isn't that great? Because our readers will think, these people are buffoons and idiots. So the media has circulated and normalized that kind of language because they thought it was something readers might enjoy, that people in New York over their breakfast coffee would read about this and, oh, darling, can you believe there are people who actually think this way? So I think they normalized it without understanding the power of it. Bottom line.
Interesting. I mean, but at the same time, it's also important for us to be aware of it, right? I mean, this stuff is going to take place in those circles regardless. And Jerry Falwell is going to reach all of Jerry Falwell's flock, whether, me sitting at the breakfast table reading the New York Times, on the Upper West Side, am aware of it or not.
Well, exactly so. And one of the examples in the book I think is most telling. I talk about the AIDS crisis, and I talk about how Falwell became a proxy for Reagan since Reagan didn't say anything about it. And the media began adopting Falwell's framing of the crisis, so that when Newsweek finally did a cover story that purported to tell the truth about AIDS, their language was punishment, retribution, discipline. I mean, they basically took Falwellian terms to tell their piece. Now, they weren't necessarily adopting Falwell's critique, not at all. But Falwell had sort of set the stage for thinking about this crisis as not only a medical crisis, but a moral crisis. And I think sometimes the media hears things, and people in the media hear things, and they think that readers will respond to them without really thinking about what the upshot of their choices might be.
Interesting. Diane Winston, professor of journalism and communication at the University of Southern California, author of Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Emma. It was a pleasure to talk with you both.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.